In the unforgiving dust of the West, a good name was worth more than gold, and a bad one was a death sentence. The folks of Redemption Gulch thought they knew both. They knew the name Vance stood for honor, now buried 6 feet under, and they knew the name Blackwood stood for power, his shadow stretching over every soul in town. But they were about to learn a new name. Not of a hero or a villain, but of a broken man, a blind cowboy with no past, sold on an auction block for a handful of silver. The woman who bought him, a pregnant widow, with nothing left to lose. They all laughed. But what that blind man did next wouldn't just save a life. It would set the entire West ablaze. The sun was a merciless hammer over Redemption Gulch, beating the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated everything: the sweat-slicked horses, the warped timber of the saloon, and the grim faces of the townsfolk gathered in the square. It was the kind of heat that baked mercy out of a man's heart, leaving only hard, cracked earth behind. Saren Vance felt the heat not just on her skin, but in the pit of her stomach, a roiling anxiety that mingled with the life growing inside her. Dressed in a simple but well-kept black mourning dress, the swell of her belly was a public declaration of her vulnerability. Her husband, Thomas, had been in the ground for 3 months, the victim of a supposed cattle stampede, so violent it had left little of him to bury. Now his legacy, the Double Horn Ranch, and the child he would never meet, rested on her slender shoulders. And she was at an auction, not for livestock or land, but for men. It was a cruel spectacle, a debt and vagrancy auction run by Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for by the richest man in the county, Silas Blackwood. Men who couldn't pay their debts or were caught drifting were put on the block, their labor sold to the highest bidder for a season. It was little more than slavery dressed up in legal paper. Saren stood near the back, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, enduring the whispers and stares. "Look at her," a woman muttered behind a gloved hand. "Thomas Vance's widow. Putting on airs like she's still a queen, but she's here shopping for servants with the rest of us. Blackwood will have her ranch by winter," a man grunted. "She can't run it alone. Not in her condition." The object of their scorn ignored them, her gaze fixed on the auction platform. She wasn't here for a servant. She was here for a scarecrow. A warm body to put on the ranch, a presence to deter the scavengers who were already circling. Blackwood's men had been seen near her property lines, their casual trespasses a clear message. Buy a man, any man, and it might buy her a few more weeks. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a face like a spoiled ham, bellowed, "Next up. This one's a stray found down by the creek. Calls himself Caleb. No last name, no prospects. Got himself into a card game he couldn't afford and owes the saloon $20. 2 deputies shoved a man onto the block. He was a pitiful sight. His clothes were ragged threads hanging off a gaunt frame. A dirty bandage stained with old blood and fresh grime was wrapped clumsily around his eyes. He stumbled, his hands outstretched, seeking balance in a world of darkness. "Now I ain't gonna lie to you folks," the sheriff sneered, enjoying the show. "He's blind as a bat in a cellar. Got trampled in a stampede a few months back, he says. Can't see a lick. But he's got 2 strong hands and can follow orders long as you shout 'em loud enough. Who'll start the bidding for this prime specimen? $5 for the season." A cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. $5. Someone yelled. I'd pay $5 for him to be hauled out of town. What good's a blind cowboy? He can muck a stall, Brody countered, though his own smile was laced with contempt. Silas Blackwood watched from the saloon porch, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. He was a handsome devil, dressed in a tailored black coat, his silver hair immaculate. He caught Saren's eye and gave a slow, condescending smile, as if sharing a private joke at the blind man's expense. He wanted her to feel the town's cruelty, to understand that this was her world now, a world where the weak were torn apart for sport. The blind man Caleb stood silent on the block, his head bowed. He didn't flinch at the insults. He seemed a hollowed-out thing, a man already dead who had forgotten to lie down. No bidders. Sheriff Brody sighed theatrically. Well, I guess it's the workhouse for you, boy. $20. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. Every head turned. Saren Vance stood a little straighter. Her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. Sheriff Brody blinked. Ma'am? $20. Saren repeated, her voice firm, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. To settle his debt and his labor for the season. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $20 was a fortune for a useless hand. It was the full price of the debt. It was madness. Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He had expected her to crumble, to come begging to sell her land. This act of defiance, however small and foolish, annoyed him. He took a step forward. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. A woman in your position should be more careful with her coin. What use could you possibly have for that? He gestured dismissively at Caleb. Saren met his gaze directly. Mr. Blackwood, a woman in my position must make do with what she can afford. My late husband taught me to honor a man's debt. I am simply honoring it. The veiled insult hit its mark. The entire town knew Thomas Vance had despised Blackwood. For a moment, a dangerous silence hung in the air. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, a cold fire in them, but he couldn't challenge her openly without looking like a bully. He simply gave a curt nod to the sheriff. Sold, Brody boomed, slamming his gavel. To the widow Vance for $20. Get him off my stage. The deputies shoved Caleb toward her. He stumbled off the last step, and Saren instinctively reached out her hand, catching his arm to steady him. His skin was rough, but the arm beneath the tattered shirt was hard with lean muscle. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible shudder. Thank you, ma'am, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Save your thanks, Saren said, her tone clipped and businesslike. She had to project strength. You have a long season of work ahead of you. Can you ride if you point the horse? He said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. She led him to her wagon, the eyes of Redemption Gulch burning into her back. They thought her a fool, a sentimental pregnant widow throwing good money after bad. Maybe she was. But as she helped the blind man onto the wagon seat, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but the stubborn refusal to die. She had bought herself a scarecrow. Now she had to pray he was enough to keep the wolves at bay. The ride to the double horn was silent and tense. Caleb sat rigidly, his bandaged head turned toward the sounds of the open plains, the cry of a hawk, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the wagon wheels. He didn't speak, and Saren was lost in her own worries. The ranch was a shadow of its former glory. Thomas had been a meticulous man, But in the 3 months since his death, entropy had begun its slow work. A fence post was leaning agate, hung slightly askew. The vibrant life of the place seemed muted. Her foreman, a grizzled old cowboy named Jebediah, or Jeb, met them at the yard. He'd been with her father before Thomas, and his loyalty was to the ranch itself. His face, a road map of wrinkles and sunspots, was etched with concern as he saw who was sitting beside her. "Ma'am?" he asked, his eyes wide with disbelief as he took in Caleb's state. "Jeb, this is Caleb Seren," announced, avoiding his gaze. "He'll be working with us for the season. He can have the old bunk in the barn." Jeb looked from Seren to the blind man, his jaw working silently. He opened his mouth to protest, to question the sanity of bringing a blind, broken man to a ranch that was already on the brink, but he saw the fragile steel in Seren's eyes and thought better of it. He just nodded grimly. "I'll show him." Jeb led Caleb to the barn. "Bunk's here," he said gruffly, pointing. "Hay is fresh enough. Water pump is 10 paces out the door to your left. Don't go wandering. A blind man's got no business on a working ranch." Caleb's head tilted, as if listening to something more than Jeb's words. "I'll be careful," he murmured. He reached out his hand, finding the rough-hewn wood of the bunk with an unnerving accuracy. He ran his fingers over it, then sat down, his shoulders slumping. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. That night a storm rolled in. Seren lay in her bed, listening to the rain lash against the windows, the wind howling like a mournful ghost. The ranch house felt vast and empty without Thomas. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the panes sounded like an intrusion. She thought of the man in her barn. What had she done? She had spent her last reserves on a gesture, an act of defiance against Blackwood, and in return she had gained another mouth to feed, and a man who couldn't even see the work that needed doing. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavier than the child in her womb. Suddenly, a sound cut through the storm, sharp and unnatural. The splintering of wood. It came from the direction of the corrals. Her heart leaped into her throat. Rustlers, Blackwood's men. She grabbed the old shotgun from beside her bed, her hands trembling. Thomas had taught her how to use it, but she'd never had to point it at anything but a coyote. She crept to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. In a flash of lightning, she saw it. The gate to the main corral, where she kept her prize stallion Apollo, was swinging open. 2 figures, slick with rain, were inside, trying to get a rope on the panicked horse. Fear gave way to fury. Apollo was the last link to her husband's dream of breeding fine horses. They would not take him. She cocked the shotgun, the sound deafening in the quiet room, and headed for the door, her mind racing. But as she reached the porch, another flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and she froze. Someone was already there. A figure was moving through the rain, not with the stumbling uncertainty of a blind man, but with a silent, fluid grace. It was Caleb. He held no lantern, no weapon she could see. He moved through the familiar space of the yard, as if he could see every mud puddle, every obstacle. He wasn't walking, he was flowing. The 2 thugs had gotten a rope on Apollo and were trying to drag the terrified stallion out of the corral. "Get a move on," one of them hissed, "before someone wakes up." "Someone already has," a voice said low and calm. It was Caleb's voice, but it was different. The rasp was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet authority that sent a shiver down Seren's spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. The 2 men spun around, startled. They saw the blind man standing just inside the broken gate, his bandaged head tilted, They laughed. "Well, look what we have here," one of them sneered, a big burly man named Gus. "It's the widow's new pet. Go back to sleep, old man, before you get hurt." Caleb didn't move. "That horse belongs to Mrs. Vance. You don't." Gus dropped the rope and pulled a long skinning knife from his belt. "I tried to be nice. You've got no eyes to see what's about to happen to you." "I don't need eyes to see a coward with a blade," Caleb said. Gus lunged. Saren stifled a scream, her knuckles white on the shotgun. She was too far away, the rain too thick to risk a shot. What happened next defied all reason. As Gus charged, Caleb took a single, small step to the side. It was a perfectly timed, economical movement. Gus, expecting to hit a stationary target, plunged past him into the mud. As he went by, Caleb's hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm striking the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The knife clattered to the ground. Gus howled in pain, clutching his broken wrist. The second man, stunned, drew his pistol. "You'll pay for that." A bolt of lightning lit the scene in stark black and white. In that split second, Saren saw Caleb's posture change. He dropped low, his body coiling like a snake. He scooped up a handful of thick, wet mud from the ground. The gun fired the shot deafeningly loud, the muzzle flash a brief, angry star in the darkness. But Caleb was no longer there. He had moved again, a blur of motion. As the man tried to aim for a second shot, Caleb flung the handful of mud. It struck the man square in the face with a wet smack. The man cried out, clawing at his eyes, temporarily blinded. In that moment of distraction, Caleb closed the distance. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. A strike to the throat with the edge of his hand. A knee to the man's gun arm, forcing him to drop the pistol. A final precise blow to the side of the head that sent the man crumpling to the ground unconscious. It was over in seconds. Apollo, spooked but free, galloped to the far side of the corral. Gus was on the ground, whimpering, cradling his shattered wrist. His partner was out cold. Caleb stood over them, his chest rising and falling with his breathing. The rain washed the mud from his hands. He turned his head slowly, his bandaged eyes seeming to stare directly at the porch where Saren stood, hidden in the shadows. The unfired shotgun hanging limply in her hands. The man she had bought at auction, the pathetic blind beggar, was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone dangerous, someone who could navigate a fight in a pitch-black storm as if it were broad daylight. The whole West thought she had bought a broken man. They were wrong. She had bought a ghost, and he had just come back to life. The storm retreated as dawn approached, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. Inside the ranch house, Saren sat at her kitchen table, a mug of cold coffee untouched in front of her. The shotgun was propped against the wall nearby, a silent testament to the night's terror and confusion. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again, the fluid, impossible movements in the dark, the precise, brutal efficiency, the way Caleb had turned his head and seemed to look right through her. It wasn't just a lucky brawl. It was the work of a master. The question was a master of what Jeb found the two men when he went to do his morning round. One was still unconscious. The other, Gus, was barely coherent with pain. Jeb, a man who had seen his share of frontier justice, wasted no time. He tied them up securely, retrieved the dropped knife and pistol, and patched up the broken corral gate with a grim efficiency. He stomped into the kitchen, his face a thundercloud. "Ma'am, you'd best come see this." Saren followed him out. Gus glared at her with pure hatred, his broken wrist swelling grotesquely. "You and your crazy blind man are gonna pay for this, widow," he spat. "Blackwood will hear about this. This is what happens when you try to steal from the double horn." Jeb snarled, prodding him with his boot. "Who sent you?" Gus just laughed, a pained, ugly sound. "Go to hell." Saren looked from the bound thugs to Jeb. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice low. Jeb's expression softened with worry. "In the barn, ma'am. Hasn't said a word. Just sitting there." She found Caleb on his bunk, just as Jeb said. He was in the same position as the day before, his shoulders slumped, the dirty bandage still wrapped around his eyes. He looked once again like the broken man from the auction block, but the image was a lie. A cheap costume she could no longer believe. The ghost she had seen in the storm was still there, hiding just beneath the surface. He didn't move as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. The air in the barn was thick with unspoken questions. "They said Blackwood sent them," she said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Caleb gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His hands were resting on his knees. They were clean now, but she remembered the mud and the speed with which they had moved. "Who are you?" Saren asked, her voice shaking slightly, not with fear, but with the sheer force of the unknown. He was silent for a long moment. The only sounds were a hen clucking outside and the drip of water from the eaves. "I'm the man you bought, Ma'am," he finally said, his voice back to that dry, empty rasp. "A broke cowboy named Caleb." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her patience gone. "I saw what you did. That wasn't a broke cowboy. That wasn't a blind man. You moved. You fought." She trailed off, unable to describe it. "You knew where they were. You knew where everything was." He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. He slowly, deliberately reached up and began to unwrap the bandage from his eyes. Saren braced herself, not knowing what to expect. Scars. Mutilation. The last layer of cloth fell away. His eyes were a startling pale blue, like a winter sky. But they were clouded, milky, and unfocused. They stared blankly in her direction, but they saw nothing. The blindness was real. Saren felt a fresh wave of confusion. But how being blind isn't the same as living in an empty world, he said, his voice losing its raspy disguise, becoming clearer, deeper. The world is full of echoes, Mrs. Vance. The sound of rain on a tin roof tells you where the roof ends. The feel of the air shifting tells you a door has opened. A man's footsteps in the mud are as loud as a drum to me. That fool with the knife, I could hear the leather of his sheath groaning before he even drew it. The other one, I could hear the hammer on his pistol click back. He turned his head slightly, his sightless eyes aimed at the barn door. Right now, Jeb is standing just outside. He's shifting his weight from his left foot to his right, which means his hip is bothering him again. And he's trying not to make a sound because he's worried about you. Outside, Jeb let out a soft curse and shuffled away, his boots crunching in the gravel. Saren stared dumbfounded. It was a parlor trick, but it was real. That's impossible. "It's just listening," Caleb said simply. "When you lose one thing, the world gives you something else to make up for it. The stampede that took my sight. It took everything else too, my name, my past. All I have left is what I can hear, what I can feel." He was giving her an explanation, but it felt like only a fraction of the truth. His movements hadn't just been guided by sound. They had been honed by years of practice. The strikes were too precise, the disarms too swift. You don't learn that from going blind. You learn that from a lifetime of violence. "What do we do with them?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward the yard. "Sheriff Brody won't do a thing." "They're Blackwood's men," Caleb stated. "Let them go." "Let them go," Jeb exclaimed, having returned to the doorway. "After they tried to steal Apollo and threatened the mam. They need to be taught a lesson." "They've been taught." "One," Caleb said, turning his head toward Jeb's voice. "Gus won't be holding a knife or a gun for a long time. The other one will have headaches for a month. More importantly, they'll go back to Blackwood and tell him what happened. They'll tell him the blind man isn't helpless. That will make him hesitate. And hesitation is what you need right now. It buys you time." Seren saw the cold, strategic logic in it. It was the logic of a man accustomed to conflict. Reluctantly, she agreed. Jeb, grumbling, cut the two men loose. Gus, cradling his arm, shot a look of pure venom at Caleb before scrambling away, his partner stumbling after him. News travels fast in a place like Redemption Gulch. The story that reached Silas Blackwood's ears was a garbled, fantastical one. His two men, tough and reliable enforcers, had been beaten, not by a ranch crew, but by a single man, a blind man. They babbled about him moving like a phantom in the storm, about him hearing things no man could hear. Blackwood sat in his opulent office above the saloon, swirling a glass of whiskey. He was a man who believed in facts, not phantoms. The fact was, his men had failed. The fact was, the widow Vance was proving more resilient than he'd anticipated. And the fact was, there was now a strange new piece on the board. A blind man, he mused to Sheriff Brody, who was sweating profusely in the leather chair opposite him. "You told me he was a pathetic stray. He is Mr. Blackwood. I swear. Just a tramp who got in over his head." Brody stammered. "My men seem to disagree," Blackwood said silkily. He looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the Double Horn Ranch. "Find out who he is. I don't mean the name Caleb. I want to know where he came from, what his real name is, who he rode with. A man with those kinds of skills doesn't just appear out of thin air. Someone somewhere knows him. Dig it up." Back at the ranch, a new fragile routine began to form. Caleb was no longer just the blind man. He was an enigma. He did his work with a quiet competence that baffled Jeb. He mucked stalls, his movements sure and certain. He could tell by the sound and feel of a hoof if a horse had a stone in it. He could mend a leather strap with the precision of a master craftsman, his sensitive fingers reading the material like a book. But it was in the small moments that Seren saw the depths of his abilities. One afternoon, she was sitting on the porch mending one of Thomas's old shirts when a sudden breeze kicked up. A piece of paper, a receipt from her desk just inside the door, was whisked off the table and fluttered out into the yard. "Oh, bother," she sighed, starting to get up, her body feeling heavy and awkward. "I'll get it tout de suite," Caleb said. He was sitting on the steps carving a piece of wood with a small knife. He rose and walked directly into the yard. The paper skittered and danced in the wind, a difficult target for a sighted man to track. Caleb simply stopped, closed his eyes, a meaningless gesture, she realized, and tilted his head. He took 2 steps to his left, knelt down, and picked up the paper, just as the wind pressed it against his leg. He walked back and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, and a strange jolt like static electricity passed between them. "How did you do that?" she whispered. "I listen to it," he said. "The sound paper makes when it scrapes against the dust is different from the sound of a leaf. It's drier." He was teaching her to perceive the world differently. He'd point out the way the wind whispered through the cottonwoods before a rain, a different sound from the way it rustled the pines. He taught her how to tell the health of the land by the smell of the soil. He was more connected to her ranch in his blindness than any sighted man she had ever known. A cautious trust began to grow. She found herself talking to him, telling him about Thomas, about their dreams for the ranch. He was a quiet, attentive listener. He never offered platitudes or easy comfort. He just listened, and in his listening, she felt a sense of validation of being heard that she hadn't realized she was missing so desperately. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows, they were sitting on the porch. The baby kicked a sudden sharp jab. Seren gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Caleb asked, his head snapping up. A small smile touched Seren's lips. "It's the baby. He's a strong one." She hesitated, then took a breath. "Would you?" She left the question hanging in the air. After a moment, Caleb slowly, hesitantly reached out his hand. Seren took it and guided it to her belly. His hand was calloused and rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He held it there, his face a mask of concentration. Just then, the baby kicked again, right against his palm. A look of profound wonder transformed Caleb's face. The hard lines softened, the guarded expression vanished, replaced by a genuine, breathtaking awe. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "It's a miracle," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if burned the mask of the stoic wanderer, slamming back into place. But Seren had seen it. In that moment, she hadn't been looking at a gunslinger or a ghost. She had been looking at a man full of a deep, ancient sorrow. A man who understood loss and who had just felt the promise of a new life. Her heart ached for him, for the secrets and pain he carried. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that his past was a dangerous country, and she feared more than anything that Silas Blackwood was the one man ruthless enough to find a map. The telegram that arrived for Blackwood a week later was short and cryptic. He had sent inquiries to marshals and Pinkerton agents in 3 territories, asking about skilled fighters who had gone blind or disappeared after a stampede. Most replies were dead ends, but one from a retired lawman in the Texas Panhandle was different. "Blackwood. Stop. Regarding your inquiry, no blind men match description, but stampede near Llano Estacado, 2 years back. A legend disappeared after. They called him the Silent Gun. Some said his real name was Silas Kane. They called him Shadow. Fastest draw anyone ever saw. Killed the Ruiz brothers in a fair fight 3-1. Vanished without a trace. Assumed dead. Stop." Blackwood read the telegram twice. Silas Kane. Shadow. A legend. He looked at the name again. Silas. The same as his own. A strange, twisted smile spread across his face. The irony was exquisite. He slowly crumpled the telegram in his fist. A blind legend hiding on a widow's ranch. The game had just become infinitely more interesting. He wasn't just trying to take a piece of land anymore. He was going to break a myth, and he would enjoy every second of it. Silas Blackwood savored the name on the telegram like a fine wine. Silas Shadow Kane. It was poetry. The most feared gunslinger of the last decade, a man who had become a campfire legend, was living as a blind beggar in his own territory. Blackwood felt a surge of exhilaration. This wasn't about land anymore. This was about legacy. Crushing the widow Vance was business. Breaking Silas Kane was history. He wouldn't send thugs again. That was a tool for mongrels. Kane was a lion, even a blind one. And you didn't send dogs after a lion. You starved him. You poisoned his waterhole. His new plan was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its cruelty. The lifeblood of the Double Horn Ranch was Sage Creek, a ribbon of clear water that flowed down from the Blackwood-owned foothills, snaking through Saren's pastures before joining the main river. Thomas Vance had always had a gentleman's agreement with Blackwood's father about the water rights. But agreements between gentlemen die with them. Within a week, a crew of Blackwood's men operating under the guise of land improvement began constructing a dam at the top of the creek on Blackwood property. It was a perfectly legal act. He owned the land. He owned the water source. There wasn't a law in the territory that could stop him. Sheriff Brody made a great show of inspecting the site and declaring it all above board. At the Double Horn, the effect was not immediate. But day by day, the creek began to shrink. The cheerful gurgle quieted to a listless trickle. The once lush banks began to recede, exposing cracked, thirsty mud. "He's killing us, ma'am," Jeb said, his voice grim, as he stood with Saren looking at the dying creek. The cattle were already gathering near the shallow, murky pools, lowing with anxiety. "The grass will be gone in a fortnight. The herd won't survive a month. He doesn't have to fire a shot. He's just going to wait for us to die of thirst." The pressure was immense, a slow, suffocating vice. The ranch that had been a symbol of hope was becoming a dust bowl. Serene's morning sickness returned with a vengeance, a physical manifestation of the stress and despair. Caleb felt the change in every way a man like him could. He felt the dryness in the air, the lack of moisture in the soil beneath his boots. He could hear the stressed, higher-pitched cries of the cattle. He could smell the decay as the creek bed's vegetation began to wither. To him, the ranch was groaning in pain. He and Saren now worked as an undeclared unit. The pretense of master and servant was long gone. They were two souls against a siege. He took on the heaviest work, his lean strength surprising Jeb daily. But no amount of hard work could make water appear from a dry creek bed. Blackwood wasn't content with just economic warfare. He began his psychological assault. He let the secret of the telegram leak. It dripped into the town's consciousness like a slow poison, first as a whisper in the saloon, then as gossip over a general store counter. "Did you hear the widow's blind man? He ain't who he says he is. They say he's Silas Kane, the gunslinger, the one who shot down the Ruiz boys in cold blood." The town's perception of Saren shifted from pity to fear and suspicion. She was no longer a foolish widow. She was a woman harboring a notorious killer. When she rode into town for supplies, conversations would stop. Mothers would pull their children closer. The storekeeper, who had once given her credit, now demanded cash up front, his eyes full of distrust. She was an outcast. The isolation was crushing. One evening after a humiliating trip to town, Saren broke. She sat on the porch, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The weight of the dying ranch, the hostile town, the future of her child, it was all too much. Caleb stood in the doorway listening to the sound of her grief. It was a sound sharper than any blade, more painful than any memory. He had spent 2 years running from his past, seeking an oblivion he thought he'd found in that debt auction. He wanted nothing more than to be a ghost, to leave no trace. But Seren Vance had tethered him to the world. Her desperate act of kindness of defiance had given him a reprieve, and in doing so had entangled him in her fate. He could leave. He could slip away in the night, just as he had, from the Llano Estacado. He could find another dusty town, another name, another way to be invisible. The thought was a tempting siren song of self-preservation. He walked out onto the porch and sat not beside her, but on the steps below, creating a respectful distance. He said nothing for a long time, simply sharing the twilight with her. "I can't do this," she finally whispered, her voice raw. "He's won. I should just sell it to him. Maybe he'll give me enough to get somewhere else, to start over." "He won't," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. "He'll give you pennies, and he'll run you out of the county with nothing. A man like Blackwood doesn't want to win. He wants to annihilate." He paused, then spoke the words that would change everything. "He knows who I am, Seren." She looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the rising moon. "Is it true, what they're saying?" He nodded slowly. "My name is Silas Kane. The stories they tell, some of them are true. I've done things I'm not proud of. I lived by the gun, and I created a lot of ghosts. After the fight with the Ruiz brothers, I looked at the men I'd killed, and I looked at the bag of money I'd been paid, and I didn't see a difference between them and me. I was just the one who was faster. I ran. I wanted to bury Silas Kane for good. The stampede that took my sight felt like a judgment, a chance to be someone else, to be no one." He turned his head, his blind eyes seeming to search her face. "But Blackwood dragged him back, and now he's put you in the crossfire." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling, but with a new sliver of resolve. Her using the word "we" hung in the air. It was an affirmation, an alliance. "We stop fighting his war," Caleb Silas said. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The weariness in his voice was being replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "We can't win a battle of attrition. He has more money, more men, and more time. We can't win a legal battle. He owns the sheriff and the law, so we have to change the battlefield. How men, like Blackwood, they build their empires on a foundation of secrets and fear. His dam is legal. His intimidation is deniable. But he's a predator, and predators leave tracks. Your husband's death. Jeb told me it was the cleanest stampede he'd ever seen. No other riders caught in it, no scattered herd. Just one man trampled beyond recognition. The implication hung unspoken and horrifying in the cool night air. Seren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You think he... I think a man who will starve a pregnant woman off her land is capable of anything," Silas replied. "Blackwood doesn't just want the land. There's something more. He's greedy, but he's also impatient. The way he's pushing, it's personal. We can't prove any of it without leverage, without evidence." A new energy sparked between them. The despair began to recede, replaced by a dangerous, desperate hope. His office, Seren said, her mind racing. Above the saloon. He keeps everything there. Ledgers, deeds, letters. He'll have it guarded. And he'll be there most of the day and night, Silas countered. Getting in is one thing. Finding a specific piece of paper in the dark is another. "Not for you," Seren said, looking at him with new understanding. "Your darkness is different from ours. A plan began to form, a wild and improbable gamble. It was a heist born of desperation. They couldn't fight Blackwood's strength, so they would attack his secrets. Silas spent the next 2 days in what seemed like a trance. He walked the perimeter of the ranch not as a laborer, but as a scout. He'd stand for an hour at a time, his head tilted, just listening. He was mapping the world, recalibrating his senses for the fight to come. He had Jeb describe the layout of Redemption Gulch in excruciating detail. The width of the main street, the location of every alleyway, the number of steps from the sheriff's office to the saloon. The type of wood the saloon stairs were made of pine, Jeb thought, because they always creaked. "The back stairs," Silas murmured, processing the information. "Jeb, you said there's a window to Blackwood's office that overlooks the rear alley." "Aye," Jeb confirmed. "But it's on the 2nd story. And he keeps it locked tight." "Everything has a sound," Silas said cryptically. The night they chose was 2 days later, during the new moon. The darkness would be absolute, a perfect cloak for their endeavor. The plan was twofold. Seren and Jeb would create a diversion, a fire small and controlled but big enough to draw attention. They'd light up a patch of dry brush on the far side of town, away from any property, but close enough to cause a panic and draw the sheriff and any idle hands out of the town center. While the town was distracted, Silas would make his move. He would not go as a gunslinger. He would go as the one thing they all still believed him to be, a blind beggar. His weakness was his greatest disguise. That evening, as they made their final preparations, Seren found him by the corral, checking the saddle on her horse. He had insisted she and Jeb ride for a quick getaway. He would go on foot. "Silas," she said softly. He turned toward her voice. "Ma'am, be careful." The words were inadequate. "Blackwood thinks he's fighting the ghost of Silas Kane, the gunslinger." He said, his voice a low rumble. "He's not. He's fighting the man you gave a second chance to. That makes me more dangerous." He reached out, and for a moment she thought he would touch her face. Instead, his hand gently rested on her stomach where the baby was. He held it there for a heartbeat, a silent promise. Then he turned and melted into the darkness, his footsteps making no sound on the dry earth. He was no longer running from the shadow. He was becoming it. The darkness over Redemption Gulch was absolute, a starless veil perfect for a ghost. Silas Kane moved through it, his bare feet reading the story of the land. In the alley behind the general store, he became Caleb the beggar, once more a slumped shadow waiting for his cue. He listened past the town's low hum, focusing on the saloon, his senses painting a picture of the world in sound and vibration. Miles away behind a rocky outcrop, Seren gave Jeb a firm nod. He tossed their lantern into a gully thick with tumbleweeds. The glass shattered, and the fuel ignited with a hungry whoosh, birthing a frantic wall of orange flame that clawed at the night sky. The effect was immediate. Shouts erupted, followed by the frantic clang of a bell. Men spilled from the saloon, their voices a chaotic chorus running toward the excitement. From his alley, Silas heard it all, the panic, the running feet of Sheriff Brody, the slamming doors. He filtered it out, listening for a single sound. There it was, the heavy, arrogant footsteps of Silas Blackwood, not running with the crowd, but moving to his office window to watch his town scurry. It was the opening. Silas crossed the alley, his feet silent on the packed dirt. He used a rain barrel as a launch pad, his fingers finding purchase on the rough-hewn timber of the saloon's back wall. He scaled the structure with a spider's grace, his senses guiding him to stable handholds, his movements a fluid ascent in the dark. He reached the second-story window of Blackwood's office. A pair of thin metal picks materialized from a pouch at his belt. Pressing his ear to the glass, he listened to the faint inner workings of the lock. With delicate, precise movements, he manipulated the tumblers until they yielded with a soft snick, a sound only he could hear. He slid the window open and slipped inside. The room reeked of Blackwood's power leather whiskey and cigars. Silas stood motionless, letting the office map itself in his mind. The tick of the mantel clock, the draft from the door, the solid presence of the heavy oak desk. It was there he moved his fingers, dancing over its surface, feeling for an imperfection. He found it near the base, a subtle mismatch in the wood grain. He pressed, and a floorboard beneath the desk clicked open. Inside was a locked metal box. The cheap lock was a triviality, its tumblers surrendering in seconds. He lifted the lid. His hands sifted through deeds and telegrams, his sensitive fingers feeling the impression of ink on paper. At the bottom, he found the prize, a small leather-bound journal, its pages dense with an arrogant, angry script. He knew with absolute certainty this was the heart of Blackwood's secrets. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, Blackwood's returning footsteps, heavy and annoyed on the stairs. He was coming back far too soon. There was no time for the window. Silas grabbed the journal and a fistful of deeds, stuffing them inside his shirt as he slid the floorboard back into place. The only cover was a pair of thick velvet curtains beside a bookshelf. He slipped behind them just as a key turned in the lock. Blackwood entered, holding a glass of whiskey. He strode to the front window, irritated by the dying commotion of the fire. "Fools," he muttered. Silas stood 5 feet away, a ghost behind the cloth, his breathing perfectly controlled. Blackwood turned his sharp eyes, scanning his domain. His gaze swept the room and paused, lingering on the curtain where Silas hid. Silas felt the man's attention like a physical pressure. But Blackwood's eyes were drawn downward. A single drop of muddy water from the rain barrel had fallen from Silas's boot onto the polished floor. Blackwood's expression sharpened. He walked slowly toward the back window, his senses now on high alert. He saw the fresh scratches on the lock. "So the rat came for the cheese," Blackwood said to the room, a cruel smile forming. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he walked to his desk. "I wondered if you had it in you, Kane. You can come out. The game is over." Silas remained still, a statue in the shadows. Fine Blackwood sighed. He struck a match and casually tossed it toward the curtain. The dry velvet erupted in flames. Faced with burning alive or revealing himself, Silas exploded from the fire, rolling across the floor to smother the embers on his clothes. Blackwood laughed, a sound of pure, delighted cruelty. His pistol was in his hand, but he aimed it loosely, savoring his victory. "There you are, the legendary Silas Kane, blind, covered in soot, hiding in my office like a common thief. The papers I have say you're the thief. Blackwood." Silas snarled, getting to his feet, one hand protectively covering the journal in his shirt. "Those papers will burn with you," Blackwood said calmly. "Sheriff Brody will find your charred body. A tragic end for a troubled soul." He raised the pistol to fire. Silas couldn't dodge. He had to move the world instead. With a roar, he kicked the leg of the massive oak desk. The desk shrieked across the floor, slamming into Blackwood's legs. Blackwood bellowed in pain and surprise, his shot going wide and shattering a bottle on a shelf. In that split second, Silas launched himself forward, under the gun's arc. He drove his shoulder into Blackwood's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the wall. Blackwood's head connected with the timber with a sickening thud, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Dazed but fueled by rage, Blackwood drew a knife from his boot and lunged. But he was fighting in Silas's world now. Silas heard the whistle of the blade and ducked under a wild slash, his body moving with brutal economy. He delivered 3 precise strikes to the ribs, the bicep, and a final sharp blow to the side of the neck. Silas Blackwood crumpled unconscious to the floor. Smoke was filling the room as the fire spread. Silas grabbed the journal where it had fallen, retrieved Blackwood's pistol, and vaulted out the open window. He landed lightly in the alley below and melted into the darkness. He met Seren and Jeb at a cave a mile from town. He emerged from the night smelling of smoke, but radiating triumph. He handed the leather-bound journal to Seren. "I think you'll find this makes for interesting reading." By the flickering lamplight, Seren opened the journal. It was all there, written in Blackwood's own arrogant hand. The bribes, the land grabs, the methodical ruin of his rivals. And on the final pages, a chilling, detailed account of how he and 2 men had orchestrated the cattle stampede that killed Thomas Vance, eliminating a man who refused to be bought and was about to expose him. Tears of vindicated grief streamed down Seren's face. Justice was in her hands. The next morning, Seren rode into Redemption Gulch. She didn't go to the sheriff. She walked onto the porch of the general store, held the journal high, and in a voice ringing with conviction, she began to read. With every damning word from Blackwood's own pen, the town's fear of her turned to righteous fury against him. They heard of his contempt for them, his crimes, and the cold-blooded murder of one of their own. The tide turned with the force of a flash flood. When a federal marshal summoned by a pre-dawn telegram from Seren rode into town with a posse, the people of Redemption Gulch pointed him straight to the saloon, where a battered Silas Blackwood and a terrified Sheriff Brody were arrested without a fight. The West was shocked not by the return of a fabled gunslinger, but by the indomitable will of a pregnant widow and the blind man who had seen the truth. Days later, Seren stood on her porch and watched the first hopeful trickle of water flow down the bed of Sage Creek. The dam was gone, the ranch's heartbeat returning. Silas stood beside her, no longer a ghost or a beggar, but simply a man. "What will you do now?" Seren asked softly. "Everyone knows your name." "A name is just a word," he said, turning his face toward the sound of her voice. "Actions define a man. I think I'd like to try building something for once." He paused, his next words full of a quiet hope. "If you'll have me." Seren looked at the quiet strength in him, a strength that had saved her, and thought of the child who would soon be born. She reached out and took his hand. "The double horn could use a good foreman," she said, a true, brilliant smile finally reaching her eyes. "Welcome home, Silas." In the end, the story that shocked the West wasn't about the legend of Silas Shadow Kane the gunslinger. It was about the redemption of Silas Kane the man. It was a story of how true sight has nothing to do with the eyes, and how strength is often found in the people everyone else has written off. Seren Vance bought a man at an auction hoping for a scarecrow, but she found a guardian. And Silas Kane, a man running from his own shadow, found a light in the darkness. He found a home. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love in the heart of the Wild West moved you, help us share it with the world. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of history, heart, and the untamed human spirit. Thank you for listening.